530 feet beneath the surface of Lake Superior, there is a ship. She is the most famous shipwreck in the Great Lakes, and she is lying on the bottom in two broken pieces. The bow stands upright, driven into the mud, still pointed forward, as if she were trying to finish a voyage she will never complete. The stern lies more than 250 feet away, rolled completely upside down. Scattered between the two halves is her cargo, 26,000 tons of iron ore poured out into the dark. This is what is left of the Edmund Fitzgerald, and every one of the 29 men who sailed her on her final night is still down there with her. Not a single body was ever brought home. She went down in less than a minute, in water so cold that almost nothing decays. She sent no distress call, she launched no lifeboats, and 50 years later, with all of our technology, no one has ever proven what killed her. The wreck itself is the only witness left, and when the cameras finally reached the bottom, they found something lying in the silt that quietly rewrote the entire story. So tonight, we are going to descend 530 feet to what is left of the largest ship ever lost on the Great Lakes, and we are going to read that wreck like a crime scene, piece by piece, to answer the question that has haunted these waters for half a century. What really happened to the Edmund Fitzgerald? But before we go to the bottom, you have to understand the ship, because the Fitzgerald was never just another freighter. She was a celebrity. In 1957, the Northwestern Mutual Life Insurance Company of Milwaukee did something no American insurance company had ever done. They did not invest in someone else's vessel. They built their own. They spent roughly $7 million, more than $80 million in today's money, to construct the largest ship the Great Lakes had ever seen. She measured 729 feet long. Stand her on end, and she would have risen higher than a 60-story building. And she was not fitted out like an ordinary ore carrier. Her interior was designed by a famous Detroit department store. Deep carpeting, tiled bathrooms, leather chairs, a guest lounge, and air conditioning in the crew quarters, which was almost unheard of on a working freighter in the 1950s. She hauled 26,000 tons of raw iron ore, but she looked like she had been built for executives on vacation. Northwestern Mutual named her after the company's president, Edmund Fitzgerald, and on June 7, 1958, more than 15,000 people came to watch her launch. That was more people than the Detroit Tigers drew to an average game that year. And then the christening went wrong. The president's wife stepped forward to break the ceremonial bottle across the bow. She swung. It did not break. She swung again. Still nothing. On the third try, it finally shattered. In maritime tradition, a christening that has to be attempted 3 times is considered a bad omen. And when the great hull slid sideways into the water, it threw up a wave so large that, by several accounts, it collapsed a grandstand on the shore, and one spectator died of a heart attack at the launch. But the Fitzgerald went to work anyway. She carried taconite, iron ore rolled into small dark pellets, from the mines of Minnesota down to the steel mills of Detroit and Toledo. She broke seasonal cargo records 6 different times, often beating her own. She was fast, she was famous, and to the people who lived along these lakes, she seemed close to unsinkable. She was one of the first ships ever to move more than 1 million tons of ore through the locks in a single season. One of her captains became famous for playing music over the ship's loudspeakers as she passed through the rivers, and crowds gathered on the banks just to watch her go by. They called her the Queen of the Lakes. For 13 years, she was the largest vessel on the Great Lakes. But the Queen would reign for only 17 years, and she would die on a night when Lake Superior proved that no ship is royalty. On the afternoon of November 9th, 1975, the Edmund Fitzgerald loaded 26,000 tons of taconite at Superior, Wisconsin, bound for a steel mill near Detroit. At her helm was Captain Ernest McSorley, 63 years old. According to the researcher John U. Bacon, even McSorley's rivals called him the finest captain on the Great Lakes. This was meant to be one of his last voyages before retirement. By Bacon's account, he had reportedly taken the extra trip to help cover his wife's medical bills. She was waiting for him at home. On the lake, McSorley was joined by a second freighter, the Arthur M. Anderson, under Captain Bernie Cooper, about 15 miles behind. Knowing a storm was coming, the two captains took the northern route, hugging the Canadian shore for shelter, then turning southeast for Whitefish Bay. This was standard practice. When the November gales came, you ran for cover, but by the morning of November 10th, they were deep inside the storm. The winds climbed past 50 knots, and the waves kept building. The National Weather Service had upgraded its gale warning to a full storm warning, but McSorley had been through November gales before. Every captain on the lakes had. At 20 minutes before 2 in the afternoon, he radioed the Anderson. The Fitzgerald was rolling a little. Nothing alarming yet. By 3:30, that had changed. McSorley reported a fence rail down, 2 vents lost or damaged, and a list. The ship was leaning. Something was wrong. At 10 minutes past 4, he reported something worse. Both of his radars had failed. Think about that for a moment. A 729-foot ship in the heart of a November storm, with no radar and almost no visibility through the snow. McSorley was now effectively blind. The only eyes he had left belonged to the Anderson, 15 miles back, calling his position over the radio. And then he told them this was one of the worst seas he had ever been in. Remember who was saying this? A 63-year-old master with more than 4 decades on the water, weeks from retirement. If the storm had shaken McSorley, it should have terrified everyone. Out on his deck, the lake was no longer throwing spray. It was rolling solid water clean across the ship, the full weight of Superior pouring over her and draining away. By 7 that evening, the Anderson was recording gusts near 60 knots and waves over 25 feet. The Fitzgerald was now about 15 miles from the safety of Whitefish Bay. So close. At her normal speed, that was barely 2 hours of sailing. She would not last 15 minutes. At 10 minutes past 7, Cooper called her one last time. He asked, "How are you making out with your problems?" And McSorley's answer went straight into maritime history. He said, "We are holding our own. No panic, no mayday, no call for help." And then, 10 minutes later, the Edmund Fitzgerald simply vanished from the Anderson's radar. One moment, there was a 700-foot ship on the screen. The next, there was only snow, and an empty stretch of black water where the largest vessel on the lake had been. 29 men, gone. Cooper turned the Anderson around and drove her straight back into the storm to look for survivors. He found nothing. No lifeboats. No survivors. The Coast Guard station nearby was overwhelmed, its own antennas torn down by the same storm. No one wanted to believe a ship that size could simply be gone. But she was, and not one body was ever recovered. There is a cold reason for that. Lake Superior is so cold, especially 530 feet down, that a body does not return to the surface the way it would in the ocean. The old sailors have a saying about this lake. They say Superior never gives up her dead. And in the case of the Fitzgerald, she never has. And here is where this stops being a story about a storm, and starts becoming something closer to a crime scene. because the only witness left was the wreck itself. 4 days after the sinking, a United States Navy aircraft found her, sensing the magnetic disturbance of all that steel resting on the bottom. Sonar picked up 2 large objects on the lake floor, but could not say what they were. So in May of 1976, the Navy sent down an unmanned cable-controlled submersible. It brought back more than 43,000 feet of videotape and nearly 900 photographs. And what those cameras revealed was devastating. The Edmund Fitzgerald was lying on the bottom in 2 enormous pieces, 530 feet down. The bow section, about 276 feet long, stood upright, driven so hard into the mud that it looked planted there. The stern, about 253 feet, lay capsized, rolled completely upside down, roughly 170 feet away. Between them was a long field of wreckage, taconite pellets, torn hull plating, and hatch covers scattered across the lake bed. This is what is left of her. This is what waits in the cold and the dark, where the temperature barely rises above freezing and no daylight has ever reached. A 700-foot ship, snapped clean in 2, the halves now facing in opposite directions, more than half a football field apart. Whatever happened to her, it had not been gentle. Nothing grows on her down there. Nothing has rusted away the way it would in the salt of the ocean. In a strange way, she is almost perfectly preserved, frozen in time on the floor of the lake. The wreck answered one question the moment the cameras saw it. She had not slipped quietly beneath the waves and settled in one piece. She had broken apart, but it raised a far darker one. What broke her? This is where the story splits into 3. The Coast Guard released its report in July of 1977. Its most probable cause was flooding through the cargo hatches, water pouring in through covers that had not been properly sealed as the great waves rolled over the deck. A former crewman testified that the ship did not always fully secure all 68 clamps that held those covers down. And here is how that kills a ship: a hatch that looks closed but is not fully clamped. 25-foot waves breaking over the deck, hour after hour. Each one forces a little more water down into the hold. The ship rides lower, takes even more water over the deck, and floods faster. It is a trap that closes slowly, and then all at once. But not everyone agreed. The National Transportation Safety Board concluded the hatch covers had not simply leaked. They had failed all at once. By their analysis, late that evening, the ship was riding so low that her deck was almost at the surface, and a single great wave could have caved in a hatch and sent her down in minutes. And there is a chilling piece of testimony that fits this. Around 6:30, Captain Cooper watched 2 enormous waves, perhaps 35 feet high, roll over his own ship and continue on into the dark, in the exact direction of the Fitzgerald. Sailors call waves that travel in a group like that the Three Sisters. By Cooper's reckoning, they would have reached her at almost the moment she disappeared. And then there was a third theory. The Lake Carriers Association argued that the Fitzgerald had run over a shallow ridge near Caribou Island, tearing open her hull beneath the waterline, hours before she sank. An investigator reported finding scrape marks on that shoal. The Coast Guard sent divers to check, found no definitive proof, but admitted they could have missed it. And here is the detail that makes that theory harder to dismiss. The Edmund Fitzgerald carried no fathometer, the instrument that measures the water beneath a ship. It simply was not required. Her only way to measure depth was a weighted rope, thrown over the bow by hand. And in a 60-knot gale, no one was leaning over the bow with a rope. She was sailing blind in more ways than one. 3 investigations, 3 different conclusions. and the Coast Guard's own report admitted that the exact cause could not be determined. The ship had taken the answer with her, to the bottom. But almost 20 years after she sank, the wreck gave up a secret that none of the three theories had accounted for. For years, only machines had visited the Fitzgerald. Then, in the summer of 1994, two expeditions reached the wreck within weeks of each other. The first, publicly funded, made several dives and came away convinced that nothing it had found explained why the ship went down. The second was privately funded, led by a man who was not a thrill seeker, but a researcher. Someone who had studied charts and old reports for years before he ever went down. His team spent hours over the wreck, and on one of those dives, near the bow, partly buried in the silt, they found something no previous expedition had ever seen. A human body. It was lying near the bow, dressed in coveralls, wearing a life jacket. In nearly 20 years of expeditions, no one had ever found human remains. The frigid, lightless water had preserved the body in the darkness for almost 2 decades. It was the first physical proof, after almost 20 years, that the men of the Fitzgerald were still down there, exactly where she fell. And that life jacket sits at the center of an argument that still has not been settled. For years, the leading idea was that the Fitzgerald went down so suddenly that her crew had no warning at all. A hatch collapses, the bow dives, and the ship is gone in seconds. But if the end truly came that fast, then how did a man have time to find a life jacket and put it on? To some, that single detail reopened the oldest question of the disaster. What did the crew know, and when did they know it? Maybe the end was not instant. Maybe it was just slow enough for a sailor to understand what was happening to his ship, and to reach for the one thing that might save him. But there is another reading, and it comes from the people who would actually know. Ask anyone who has spent a career on these lakes, and they will tell you there is nothing strange about a man wearing a life jacket in a storm like that one. When a ship starts taking heavy water and leaning to one side, you put one on. Not because the end is near, because that is simply what a careful sailor does. By that reading, the life jacket proves only that the crew knew they were in serious trouble, which, by then, every man aboard surely did. So which was it? A sign that the crew saw the end coming, or just a seasoned sailor doing the sensible thing in the worst weather of his life? 50 years later, people are still unable to agree. And the men who filmed that body understood at once that they were not looking at a dive site. They were looking at a grave. They had close, clear footage of the remains, but chose not to release the sharpest images, out of respect for the dead. And after that discovery, the way the world was allowed to treat the Edmund Fitzgerald began to change for good. The following year, 2 divers did something almost no one believed was survivable. They reached the Edmund Fitzgerald without a submersible at all. Just scuba gear and a special breathing mixture, descending into water that kills careless divers. 530 feet down, ordinary air becomes poison. A single mistake at that depth does not injure you. It kills you. It took them about 6 minutes to fall to the bottom, only minutes to look, and roughly 3 hours to rise back up, stopping again and again in the black water to keep from dying on the way home. By most accounts, they are the only 2 people ever to touch the Edmund Fitzgerald with their own hands, and almost no one will ever do it again, because that same year, a larger expedition arrived to recover the ship's bell. The Canadian Navy sent a diving support ship with a crew of more than 80. A diver in a hard armored suit that works like a one-man submarine cut the 200-pound bronze bell free of the wreck. In its place, they lowered a replica engraved with the names of all 29 men and left it on the bottom as a grave marker. The original was raised, cleaned, and placed in the Great Lakes Shipwreck Museum at Whitefish Point, and then the families moved to seal the wreck for good. In 2006, the Canadian government drew a 500-meter protected zone around the Edmund Fitzgerald. Diving to her, filming her, or even aiming a sonar device at her without a license now carries a fine of up to 1 million Canadian dollars. And there is one strange complication. Researchers who reached the wreck in the 1990s found that the international boundary between the United States and Canada had been redrawn more than once on the charts. By their measurements, part of the wreckage may actually lie in American waters, not Canadian at all. Enter the coordinates into one mapping service, and the wreck appears in Canada. Enter the very same coordinates into another, and it appears in the United States. 2 maps, 2 countries, 1 shipwreck. But no one has ever moved to challenge the protection. The families do not want her disturbed, and the lake does not seem to want to let her go. So the answer to what killed the Edmund Fitzgerald is still down there. It is just locked behind 530 feet of black water and a $1 million fine. The maritime historian Fred Stonehouse has said the wreck has been effectively off limits for decades, and that the precise cause will likely never be known. And that is the quiet tragedy underneath the famous one. We have the wreck, we have the witness, we have the technology to question her, and we have chosen to leave the question unanswered. And there is one more detail that makes the whole tragedy harder to accept. According to the National Transportation Safety Board, by 1975 the rules had been relaxed, and the Fitzgerald was riding more than 3 feet deeper in the water than her original design had ever intended, which means the waves did not have to climb as high to reach her deck. The margin for error was already gone before the storm ever hit her. A forensic analysis years later reached the same verdict. There was probably no single dramatic cause. Instead, a chain of small failures, each one survivable on its own, stacked up over the hours of that storm until the ship could no longer stay afloat. A torn fence rail, 2 lost vents, a growing list, 2 dead radars, a deck riding too low, hatches that may never have been fully sealed, and the worst seas a 40-year captain had ever seen. Any one of them, she survives. All of them on the same night, and she does not. There is no villain in this story, no iceberg, no single fatal mistake to point to. Only a great ship, a respected captain, a careful route, and a lake that found every weakness she had on the worst possible night. That is what makes her so hard to let go of. There is nothing to blame here but the lake itself. And yet, out of that loss, something was built. Since the Fitzgerald went down, not one major commercial ship has sunk on the Great Lakes. The disaster forced a complete overhaul of the rules. Survival suits for every crew member, depth finders on every vessel, stricter limits on how deep a ship could load, more frequent and more rigorous inspections. The protections that might have saved her crew were written, in the end, in their memory. 29 men died, so that thousands of others would not. It is the grim arithmetic these lakes have always run. Almost every safety rule on this water was paid for by a crew that never made it home. And every year, on the 10th of November, at the museum on Whitefish Point, that original bell is rung. Once for each man who never came home. 29 times. And then a 30th for every other sailor the Great Lakes have ever taken. Children who visit the museum are drawn straight to it, reaching up to touch the same bronze bell that a diver cut from the darkness, 530 feet down. When the 50th anniversary came, some argued that it was finally time for a new expedition. The technology now exists to answer this for good. And that leaves us with a hard question The same one that has divided the families, the historians, and almost everyone who has ever heard this story. We could solve it tomorrow. Should we? The cameras are ready. The maps are drawn. The only thing standing between us and the truth is a decision. Do the 29 men on that lakebed deserve to finally have their story told in full, with no more guessing? Or have they earned the right to be left exactly where they are, in the dark, undisturbed? There is no clean answer. The families said no, and the lake has kept her secret. But she is far from alone down there. Lake Superior holds the wrecks of hundreds of ships, going back more than a century. Many of them have never been found. The Edmund Fitzgerald is only the most famous of them. She's not the strangest, and she will not be the last one we go looking for. But tonight, she's the one we leave you with. 530 feet down, in the cold, in the dark, in the silence, in 2 broken pieces, with her crew of 29 still aboard. The largest ship ever lost on the Great Lakes is still holding her own, and she is still keeping her secret. Lake Superior never gives up her dead, and it does not appear that she ever intends to give up the answer, either.